Okay, everyone probably heard that. Okay, so this webinar is being recorded. For these paid webinars, we are going to, they're all being recorded, and this will be made available at the end of the season. But for these webinars, these paid webinars, you folks who registered and paid to participate, you'll get the link to the recording right away. And it won't be made available to the rest of the instructors until at the end of the season. We'll post all of those videos, so you all will have access to it. As soon as I get a chance to upload it, I will get that link over to everyone who registered, regardless of whether they were actually able to make the session. But this is being recorded, and by staying on the line right now, you consent to be recorded. Your name and voice should only appear in the recording if you ask a question. So just know that. Great. Okay, on to the fun part. I'm really excited about this webinar, and we're really fortunate to have Dr. Sara Boilen with us tonight. She's the clinical psychologist at the helm of Sweetgrass Psychological Services in Whitefish, Montana, and she's a backcountry user and avalanche educator. She studied human factors extensively, and her clinical practice focuses on trauma and grief. Her dissertation was on the impact of rock climbing on hope and courage, and she's a published author in the field of avalanche fatalities. She's presented at the Northern Rockies SAW, NSAW, and has been featured in Powder Magazine and in TAR. She's been studying resilience, grief, and the neuropsychological components of trauma for decades, and her trainings show it. She's an engaging presenter who adapts to the needs of her group to ensure full participation, engagement, and growth. And we are so pumped to have her here to present to us tonight. This is definitely the best name of a webinar of all of our webinars in this series. And it got me really excited as soon as I saw it. So thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad to have you here. And I'm gonna switch it over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was funny. I was like, can this be the name? I think this is what the title needs to be. It's the most accurate. So I am going to share my screen, and I would love participation. So if you have a question and you want to raise your hand on the little Zoom button, or if you want to pop something into the chat, we don't need to listen to just me this whole time, for sure. I want to clarify that tonight we're probably going to talk through some things that you're super familiar with. I'm hoping that everybody leaves here with some new idea or something that they haven't thought of before, or is, you know, a new way of looking at something old. And I know many of you have loads of experience, and so if you have things that you want to add, feel free to put them in the chat. Our kind of progression is going to be, we're going to talk a little bit briefly about facets and why I think it's really important that we sort of move beyond facets and understand cognitive biases more broadly. And a lot of avalanche education, when it comes to human factors, sort of stops at the like, so what do we do about it part. So we're going to spend a lot of time tonight. I promise you, I'm not going to give you a human problem without giving you a solution or some kind of strategy to mitigate that hazard, and hopefully I'll give you some ideas of how to teach those things to other people, because that's what you all do. And then I want to get into group dynamics and communication, and then I can't resist infiltrating your minds with a little bit about mental wellness. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, I promise, at the end. So I think when it comes to facets, right, there's like this beautiful framework that really introduced the field of avalanche education to this idea that like, maybe it's not just snow that's killing people, but maybe it's humans that are killing people. And this was like a really great place to start. And there's also a ton of information about human factors, heuristics, cognitive biases, whatever you want to call them, that exist in the realm of behavioral economics and clinical psychology. And it seems like we should be pulling from all of that knowledge as well. I know when I took my Avi 1, I was like, huh, like this is cool. And like, maybe these guys should know about all this other stuff that's out there. And so ever since then, I've been trying to work on like building this bridge. So, you know, we're not going to really dive into facets, but I just kind of want to highlight that and say like Ian McCammon really changed the game for all of us. Is really cool. So if you have never seen this, Do not do it right now because you will not listen to the rest of my presentation, but maybe tomorrow, just Google the Cognitive Bias Codex. This is a Wikipedia page. It is the coolest Wikipedia page that ever existed because all of these are actually links that take you to the cognitive bias description on Wikipedia. And you could spend, I don't know, hours, days, months, whatever, any rainy day upcoming looking at this thing. And I put it here just to sort of highlight how many cognitive biases there are, right? And cognitive biases or heuristics come from, it's really like an adaptation. So if our brains tried to process everything that was coming at us in a single moment, let alone in a day, we would be constantly overwhelmed. And so our brain has all of these ways of shortcutting the system to get to a quicker decision or to encode information faster. And so these are adaptations, but they also are liabilities because we fall for them and we don't realize that our brain has done the shortcutting, right? So today we're going to kind of review some of my favorite methods of attempted murder. So this is how your brain is trying to kill you. These are the primary ways that your brain is doing that. And again, some of these you might be super familiar with and others not. So the first thing I want to highlight for everybody is this disclaimer. I'm not going to read my slides out loud. I find that like unbearable. Like you don't really need to listen to my voice any more than you already are. But just because we know these things about how our brain operates does not make us immune to them. And I love this. And if you think you're objective, you're probably the most biased of all, right? We are all really susceptible, no matter how much of a scientific mind we have or how curious we are, or if you're like me and you study heuristics, it does not make you immune. In fact, it could make you more susceptible. So I want to highlight that because I think it's important for us to hold that in our mind, that we need to go beyond just like knowing these things. We need to actually do something about it. So we're going to start at my favorite one, confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is essentially where we look for things that we want to see in our environment, or not that we want to, but that confirm a hypothesis that we have. If you have ever had like a difficult political conversation with somebody who you were like, wait, you took that fact and you got this from it, they are probably susceptible to this confirmation bias. And confirmation bias has sort of like a twin in desirability bias, which is that we look for information that we want to see. So when we're scanning our environment, we're choosing information that sort of suits our fancy and makes us feel good. And that can be really problematic if we're missing things that are really essential. So one of the great antidotes that I think is, it's really an antidote to a lot of these cognitive biases, but particularly these two, is to assign a devil's advocate. Is that it's important that this person is a loudmouth in the group, that they're somewhat of a leader, or they have a high level of avalanche training in your group. This is not like the quiet person who's just done like one avalanche intro class, right? You want somebody who's really going to be speaking up. And you want to make it clear that this person's job is to highlight every step of the way the problems with the conclusions that the group is drawing, and to use data to do so. And we're going to talk later about how to actually have those conversations, but the first step is just to assign this person. So I guarantee you tomorrow, if like Sarah, you're talking to your friend, you're like, oh, I attended this really amazing talk with this super cool person last night, and she talked about cognitive biases, and your friend is like, oh, what one do you remember? You're going to be like, confirmation bias, because the things that our brain does is that it focuses on the first bit of information. So I like to tell this story that I remember being at like the coffee shop one morning a few winters ago, and we're all standing in line, and it's like 6:59, and at 7, like the avalanche bulletin comes out, and all of our friends and other groups, you know, they're like, oh, what does the bulletin say? So I pull it up on my phone, and it looks like this, and I hold it up. And right then I am anchoring everyone to this information. This is the first bit of information that they're getting about the hazards that day, right? They haven't gone out, they haven't poked around in the snow. And our brains anchor because it needs something to hold on to. Because remember, we're like swimming through this sea of information throughout the day. Every moment, there's thousands of bits of information. So anchoring is this really nice way of sort of saying, well, at least I know this. And that can be really problematic. And I think it's like particularly problematic on a spicy moderate day, because if we've anchored ourselves to a yellow, right, which for many people means speed up, not slow down. And we're then using our other heuristics of confirmation bias and desirability bias, because it's been considerable or high for 3 weeks. And here we are coming into a moderate day. I really want it to be the kind of moderate that means go. And so I think it's essential on days like that we're really hyper vigilant and we're really relying on that devil's advocate to say, today is a day where we are more likely to fall victim to this trap. So I think, so this is a fun activity that I do in all the level 1 classes I teach and some of the level 2 classes as well. So I ask everybody in the group to write down 3 memories from the last year of sliding around on snow. And, you don't have to write down the whole memory, but just like some little versions. Ever been to Whitefish, Montana? We like don't have a lot of bluebird days. And yet like guaranteed, when I ask people like, who had a bluebird day in their memory? Everybody's like, yes, right? And who had a day with friends? Yes. And who had a great day skiing with no trees bashing you in the face? Everybody's like, yes. And then who had a day with an avalanche? And very few people raise their hand because avalanches are actually pretty rare. And the thing that we know about the availability heuristic is that the things that are easily called to mind are the things our brain predicts and expects to find. And so you can see how all of this is building, like your brain is like this great murderous weapon, right? Because it's going to like anchor to that information. It's going to confirm what you want to see. It's going to, go for the desirability stuff. And unless you're a person who's experienced a number of avalanches, it's not even going to signal to you that that's an actual threat. And so I really like the idea of having participants talk through this and notice that. And we're going to talk a little bit more later about the importance of debriefing and exactly how to debrief. But I just want to bookmark that for you, that how we debrief teaches us a lot, because memories, and I'm not going to get like too heady on this, there's actually 3 stages to a memory. There's encoding the information. So you have to identify something that you want to remember. You have to store the information, and then you have to retrieve it. And so if you've never encoded it, so you've never like processed with your friend at the end of the day about how scary that was or how you think you got away with something, you may never even get to the storage. And then you certainly won't get to the retrieval. And then this availability heuristic is going to come in and just convince you that every day in the backcountry is going to be an awesome day with no bush, with all your friends, and amazing POW, which is just not what we have here a lot. Any questions or thoughts or anything so far? I'm not monitoring the chat, but I'm just going to plow on through. So sunk cost is another one that I think is really important, and is actually one that we can pretty easily mitigate. So sunk cost is like, the more we've invested in something, the more we need an outcome. And there's an interesting phenomenon here in this bias that whatever happens in the future actually doesn't change your investment at all. So like, you're never getting back those 3 hours that it took you to skin up this mountain. Like, you're never getting it back. And yet we sort of long for a reward for that investment. And the bigger the investment, the more we need that reward. And so you can imagine that if you're, if you have a long approach, or you're on a heli ski trip, or you're at a hut, you've paid a lot of money, you've worked really hard to get here, it's going to be harder for you to let go of that objective. And if you're a dad or a mom and you have limited time, or you've been working more than usual, or whatever it is that's limiting your, it's sort of compressing your fun, you're going to be more susceptible to this sunk cost. And one of the antidotes is to have choice points that are not just on the summit, right? So you might say to your friend, like, when we get up there, we can decide, we can always ski back down the ridge, right? And the reality is like, it's a very hard decision to actually just ski back down the ridge, right? And so where is that choice point? Maybe it's lower down on the ridge. Maybe it's when you ascend that first hill, maybe it's before you even climb the mountain. And then additionally, in the pre-mortem analysis, a lot of folks know about this one, but I love it. My partner works for the Forest Service, and he and his coworker will always joke, like, the headline tomorrow is going to be like 2 Forest Service boobs, like drove off the cliff or whatever, right? When I'm out with some of my friends who are also educators, it's like 2 avalanche educators, devoured by an avalanche. It's like, that would be embarrassing. And like, walk through, like, what is that news article? What does the avalanche report say and sound like? Okay, we're nearing the end of the like murderous weapons, but I want to talk about a couple that are related to like how we operate in the world. So basically, we think that other people do things wrong because they're stupid, and we think bad things happen to us because we're unlucky. And that's really important when it comes to like how we make sense of the day, right? Because it's rare that we would attribute something to ourselves unless it was a good thing, right? So that thing happened, like, boy, we really got unlucky, as opposed to being like, wow, that thing happened, we really shouldn't have put ourselves in that position. And then additionally, and this one's like kind of brutal for this crowd, but the moral of the story with the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the more confident you are, just based on the research, the less competent you are likely to be. And this is important when we think about ourselves, but also when we're assessing our partners, right? So it turns out that people who are more humble probably have more expertise than people who are super confident. And it's important to really like notice that and maybe talk about it. So one of the things I love doing, and I'm happy to like share these slides so you don't have to like memorize all these, although I know you're all totally memorizing every word I'm saying, but I love this. This is a Mad Libs that I created. It's like a great activity for in the hut at night or in the car ride, or if you ski with regular folks. So to understand your partners better, so to understand what is their approach to risk. So for me, like, I am a pretty cautious person by nature. I am motivated by dessert on top of mountains, time with friends, and beautiful places. My goal today is to get back to the car, and I tend to communicate by asking questions and never telling people what I think. So if we can all sort of be honest about our way of operating, and we can get to know our partners pretty well, we can have a better sense of like what mindsets are coming on this trip. What are the different attitudes? What are our purposes? So there's something interesting when it comes to how rigid we become in our decision-making process that I think is really interesting. So the more you identify your decisions or your behaviors with your values rather than like your identity, the more likely you are to be movable in your decisions. So if we, sorry, let me say that again. So if we evaluate our outcomes based on our decisions or our thoughts, like I decided the right thing, or I think it's this, and we cling to that thought, we are less likely to be movable. But if we are clinging to our value, which is getting back to the car every time, we are more likely to be able to be swayed by persuasive arguments, right? So if you're attaching your identity or the outcome to your thought or your plan, that's really hard to change your mind about. So if you understand your partner's values, you might be able to have a more persuasive argument if you think that you shouldn't be doing something, say. So a few years ago, a guy named Eric Peich and I did some research about ages of the fatalities that were happening in the backcountry. And I know, as we all know, in last year's like devastating avalanche, season, we had a reaffirmation of what our research showed. So we used to think the conventional wisdom was kind of like, if you were a dude between the ages of 19 and 26, you were like the most dangerous thing ever. And it turns out that the people who were dying were not really newbies who weren't wearing a beacon. They were actually older, more experienced folks. They were like slightly younger than me. When I turned 40, I was like, cool, I'm out of that risk category, at least until we do research in another 5 years and we find out it's just getting older. But so this is cause for curiosity. We don't have any conclusions about why this actually is, but I just wanted to highlight the difference between experience and expertise. So somebody can be doing something for, 10 years, but if they haven't learned in those 10 years, they're just doing the same thing they did that first year. And that's really just experience. And expertise is this really different thing, where this is somebody who really understands the subject. They really understand all of the traps, and they know they can predict and they can navigate around those things, right? They're not just here kind of having the same good time over and over again. And there's this great book, I have a reference list at the end, but this book, The Death of Expertise, I thought was really interesting. It's also really interesting in terms of like modern day political climate in America, where everybody's like doing their own research, and again, I think it's important to know the people that you travel with and to really be able to make this distinction. Okay, so raise your hand, you know where the button is, if you want to go for plan A tomorrow. And then, can I see when you're raising your hands? I think so. So awesome. And then raise your hand. So put your hand down and then raise your hand if you want to go for plan B tomorrow. So when I do this activity, almost everybody is like, I want to go for plan A, even without knowing what plan A is, right? Because we default to this idea that plan A is the backup plan. And so one of the things that I have sort of suggested is renaming your plans. So plan K and plan M, plan Q and plan P, right? Whatever it is, just remove that, because our brains are super lazy and they are always going to just default to the basic. And in this case, it's plan A. And I think it's really common language. We're like, okay, well, plan A will be like, well, send this ridge and then we'll ski that line. And then plan B, dun, 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 right? Like it's not that fun. And we all know it's not that fun. So just mix it up. Okay, so I'm going to pause there just for a second because that's the end of our heuristics sort of chunk. Any questions or anything? And you can feel free to just unmute yourself, or any highlights or any like, whoa, I had this epiphany.
Hi, this is Chad Thatcher, and I was wondering if you could explain more the pre-mortem analysis. So are you literally considering yourself dying and what it's going to look like?
Yeah, great question. So I'm not only considering myself dying, but I'm imagining the forecaster coming to do the site survey and understanding what happened in the avalanche, and then writing up that review of like, it was a spicy moderate day and we knew that there was wind loading on northwest faces, and yet this group went on the northwest face and they had a plan B that was to do this other thing and they opted not to, and here's why. And I'm kind of like throughout the day tracking all of that information. It's super dark and like a little creepy, to be sure. And I think it's one of the best ways, like you're almost kind of playing devil's advocate in your own mind of like trying to point out things that could get you, and drawing your attention to those things. I think for some people, like they're already so, I was talking to some fellow educators here and they're like, we don't want our AVI courses to just be like fear infusing, things, But I think for some people, this is a really helpful one. And I think for like the folks who are like real powder pigs and who have a really hard time kind of like reining in their stoke, the pre-mortem is like the ultimate buzzkill, right? And it's just gonna like get them thinking straight. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
You doing that in conjunction with a case study.
Mhm.
So you just did a case study, and then now you're going to do your own case study.
Yes.
And create that. Yeah, that's great. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So moving right along, I want to, when I'm educating folks, I really want to teach them how to think like a scientist. And the cool part in avalanche education is like, that's what you're doing all week long with these folks, right? You are teaching them how to be scientists in the snowpack. And there's actually some beautiful ways that we can be scientists when it comes to our behavior as well. And forecasters do this really nice job of having like methods woven into their day that are kind of like mental checkpoints along the way. So they have like a check-in at the beginning of the day, like what's everybody's mood, what's everybody's goal, any injuries we need to know about, right? Like risk assessment, safety checks. And we can do these sort of things with ourselves and gather data kind of as we're going along. And I think it's really important to engage this mindset. So back to that Dunning-Kruger, the more confident your group mates are, like the less curious your, travel buddies are, like the more concerned you should be, because it's also going to limit our ability to think like a scientist. I want to be really curious. I want to look for surprises in the snowpack. I want to see wind loading where we weren't expecting it. And I also want to be open in my group to how we communicate. So again, this is kind of going to be a little bit of a review. So these are some of the basics that many of us know about group dynamics. And then again, we're going to kind of get into some specifics and then talk about how to mitigate. So groupthink, which probably many of you have heard of, is basically when a group is made up of some members who are actually pretty competent and quite capable of making excellent choices, make terrible choices as a result of like group process and conformity pressures. And so what's interesting, there's kind of two pieces that I think are really interesting, is that conformity, which is sort of this desire to like become uniform. This is a human, like this is woven into our DNA. So our prefrontal cortex, which is where we make all of our decisions, is strongly affected by attachment and relationship. Our survival mechanism as babies, when we come into this world, is to be cute and lovable, lest we be like discarded, right? And that desire to be cute and lovable persists throughout our lifetime. And if you were ever a middle school girl, like how important and essential it feels, and then how devastating it is when it doesn't work out. And so that's happening in our group dynamics. We want to be accepted. We want to be liked. We don't want to be that girl who like made everybody turn around. We don't want to be that guy who slowed everybody down. And so what tends to happen is that with this influence of status, with this desire for conformity, people tend to share information that affirms the group's movement. So there tend to be questions like, is everybody cool with skiing this? Rather than who is against skiing this, right? So we do these things that kind of influence this connection and attachment. And what's really tricky is that groupthink is like particularly prominent in situations where they are stressful and when there's societal or social pressures. And that is like skiing the backcountry, right? This is like a stressful situation. And I really want to be accepted by my crew because I want to be invited back next time. And I think there's another piece, which is that leadership can really influence what gets shared amongst the group. And I'm going to get into facilitation and leadership in a little while. But I love to say that like the person in the back of the skin track probably has the most information. They're going slower, they're reflecting, they're probably by themselves. Like if they're not caught up to the group, then they're just in their head. And like maybe they're noticing stuff that the people in the front of the group who are chit-chatting aren't noticing. And I call it the French piss off, when like the group, you know, finally the last person catches up and then the rest of the people move on. And so like if you do the French piss off, like you're missing all of this information from this last human. And so making sure that like you're gonna wind up hearing from everybody. Social loafing is really common. So this is like when people with less experience, expertise, or knowledge kind of just like go along with the flow. And it's really important to create group dynamics in which newbies feel equally, you know, like they have a right to speak as much as like the group leader, so to speak. Airtime, obviously, like the loudest person is going to get like the most airtime. Horns and halos. So we all talk about the halo effect, thanks to Ian McCammon, but the horn effect is like when you tend to devalue somebody's opinion for whatever kind of personal characteristic reasons. So like, Jimmy, like he's always a naysayer, or, you know, whatever it is. So being careful to kind of watch both of those. And then finally, male groups are the worst. The end, just get some women partners to go out with. Just solo, like all male groups, they tend to be, and this is research not just from backcountry skiing, but from groups in general, they tend to kind of exacerbate these dynamics. So as I sort of said before, these are some of the things that can really exacerbate healthy group decision-making. And so really understanding, like, are these things present in our group? How are they playing out? So what do we do to have a better group, to have better group dynamics? So one of the things that you can try is to everybody take notes, and then everybody gets to share their notes. And I mean mental notes. It could be also tangible notes, like if you're digging in the snow, but that everybody gets to share a note before anybody starts moving towards the conclusion part of the conversation. So rather than saying, what do you guys think we should do? You can ask a question like, what did everybody notice so far today? And then additionally, generating multiple solutions. So like multiple conclusions, like, I think this, maybe it's this, and then really testing those out. I love the idea of using observations without evaluations. So, you know, I noticed this, period, rather than I noticed this, so I think we should this, right? So really separating out kind of the data gathering from the conclusion making part of the conversation. Talk about those issues of status. If you're not hearing from somebody in the group, ask them. You should always be attending to how many questions are you asking versus how many statements are you making. And then the beauty of framing a disagreement as an opportunity for debate. So who has an idea that's better than mine? Who sees something that I'm missing here? And you want to make it not personal, right? You want to make it like this scientific, rigorous conversation that gets people engaged and excited, rather than having their feelings hurt if somebody disagrees. Any questions about that? That was like a lot of content in a really short window. Yeah, Larry.
Hey, Sarah. So I can see how so many of these things could potentially be addressed by, you know, having a really good devil's advocate in the group. But then I also see, you know, the problem that you described of the middle school girl is that nobody wants to be that person. It's like everyone kind of hates the devil's advocate. And even though we know we need them, you know, I know when I'm out with a group, sometimes even though I know it's so valuable, I still get annoyed by that person. So how do we encourage somebody to take on that role?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And it's funny because I was just teaching a companion rescue class on Saturday, and I was with my friend who I tour with a lot. And I was like Jenny loves to be the devil's advocate. She was like, no, I don't. And I was like, oh, just kidding. So I think that's a really valid question. I think a few things come to mind. The first is like, if we can create a dynamic in which the devil's advocate is not being antagonistic, but is just part of that sort of like data gathering, and is actually, we're really celebrating like differences of opinion, like, whoa, tell me where you saw that. Like, I totally missed that, right? And whoever's in that leadership role is actually like kind of pulling them in more. And it's like, you are our most valuable player, right? But that takes like a whole group mindset to be like that excited about the person who like keeps poking. But I think that would be ideal. So that's like kind of like our top tier, we really mission impossible kind of stuff. I think beneath that, a lot of times in groups, there is like a power dynamic differential or like a skill differential. And so if that person with the most experience and expertise is in that devil's advocate role, they can actually really take that role on as like an education and like an opportunity to really inform the group of these things. And most people like learning, not everybody, but that could be like another way to kind of like make them have a really essential role that wouldn't feel as like adversarial necessarily. That is such a great question. And I'm going to think about it more too. Yeah. Chad, yeah.
Yeah. When do you make time for this? This requires a buy-in from your group to actually do this, right? And so I was wondering, I have my ideas, but what do you do to create that space for us?
I think it's super helpful to be like a clinical psychologist. So like if there's just like a disclaimer, like, oh, Boilen's here, like we're gonna be talking about feelings. But I would say that like most of my primary touring buddies really like talking about this stuff. But I also think it happens not in the field, like it happens in the planning process. It happens in how we communicate all along the way. And that these are little pieces that kind of get built upon themselves. I think it's really different if like you're touring with different folks all the time. It probably then really needs to be kind of like built in, which is why I think forecasters often have it like built into their checks, because they're going out with volunteers or with other forecasters and it's rotating all of the time. And I think, it's not that you have to do all of these things all the time. One of the projects that I'm working on, mostly in my head, but maybe someday on paper, is like kind of generating some ways for us to think about what the relevant cognitive biases are going to be any given day. So like we know that if we've been in a drought and it's a Sunday and it's a powder day and it's, yellow or even orange, like I'm worried more about sunk cost than I am some of the other biases, right? Because certain circumstances really pull for certain problems. The same with like group dynamics. And so, if you're touring with a group of 6 people, that's going to pull for different things. So maybe there's some effort put into like thinking through like, who am I going out with? Like, what's the forecast? What's the recent history? And then what are the things that need to be top of mind?
Yeah, one of the things I like about Area, they've actually taken the time to make blue books, that have these questions in them. But I was just wondering what some other ideas. I like the way you talk about it happens throughout the day. And so those are those little moments. But all right, thank you for your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think like it's funny, like in my group of girlfriends I tour with a bunch, like we always have like a plan K and a plan Q. Like it's just like that's just part of our routine now, so these things like you might have to do it once and then it kind of like goes.
One of the things I like about Area, it's really starting to create a culture that allows it. And so we really are talking about a cultural shift.
Yeah.
And I think Areas, with their curriculum has really started to create that. And hopefully we'll see it move into other areas when you see it transfer to other things like kayaking and, you know,
I hope you heard that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between facilitation and leadership. So often I
Quick,
think
Sarah,
these are-
sorry. It looks like we
Yeah.
have a question. Daryl has raised his hand with a
Oh,
question.
thank you. I can't see Daryl.
Here I am. So I've tried two things. The first is I explained that we don't have a decision until we've discussed at least two perspectives.
Mhm.
And then a way to get to different perspectives is to use some techniques that are recorded in a book called The Six Thinking Hats. Each one of the hats represents a specific perspective. Like green is, why will this plan work? Black, why will this plan work? Red, how do I feel about this plan? And so I attempt to get everybody in the group to think in that perspective. So, okay, we're going to think green right now. And why is this going to work? Why does this look like a good idea? Okay, now I want everybody to think black. So why is this not such a hot idea? So that helps having just one person be the devil's advocate, and instead gives the opportunity for everybody else to get involved.
I love that idea. Thanks for sharing. And I think what you're highlighting is like this cognitive flexibility. So can we flip back and forth between two different ways of thinking about the same problem? And that is like such a great practice for life in general. And if you can like develop a habit of that with your partners, what a beautiful thing, right? Because then, as Larry said, like you don't have to just have one person being the nag, you can all do it. I love that. And that's a really nice segue into kind of this difference. So as a leader, your goal is to get to a certain outcome. As a facilitator, your goal is to have a certain process. So just to kind of highlight that again, right? As a leader, you're focused on where you are going or what you are doing. And as a facilitator, you're focusing on how that is happening. And in any group, there are leaders, there are agreeers, and there are waiters. So there are people who are leading and kind of like taking charge. There are people who are just there to kind of nod their heads and go along. And then there are people who are going to wait until the very last second, and then they're going to say their opinion. And it's the facilitator's job to make sure that we hear from all of those folks, right? And so the person who is the quietest, like ask them the question first. If you are a leader, if you're a natural leader and you share your opinion early on in the conversation, you have just swayed the entire group. And so if you know yourself to be one of those kind of people, it's important to sort of learn to ask more questions, get more curious, kind of hold back a little bit. And, you know, I think that often folks wind up in a leadership place because they are comfortable there, or they're sort of like naturally outspoken. And so it's really essential that we actually learn how to do things differently. So questions like, who doesn't feel great about this? Who, you know, Sarah, what did you observe, right? Really pulling people in and then asking for objective data. And if you even have to stop somebody and say like, hang on, we're not going to get to conclusions just yet. We're just talking about what we found. You know, sometimes in like a bigger group, maybe like you're digging two pits, right? And you're sharing information about these two different things. Or, you know, you have one group that's kind of ahead and one group that's kind of behind, like making sure that you're pooling all of those resources prior to kind of getting there. So, I think it's also really important. So in recent years, I feel like in particular, like this idea of the objective has really sort of like come into the collective consciousness of backcountry travelers or mountain folks in general. And often when we're talking about our objective, like we're talking about the mountain or the ski line or the place that we want to be. And it's actually important that we have a goal that's a shared goal amongst the group when it comes to safety or our process, right? So like my goal is to get back to the car. Do we all share that goal? How are we approaching that goal? And if the goal is to like have a safe day out in the backcountry, as the leader or facilitator, your job is to keep people on track towards that goal. And it's also essential, I mean, and this is like the car ride there or the text exchange the night before, it's essential to make sure you know everybody's goal, because if there are conflicting goals in the group, that's going to really play out throughout the day. So one of the things that I think a lot about when it comes to backcountry travel is that, especially when we're like analyzing an avalanche, and I don't so much mean this in like a true sort of like write-up of an avalanche incident, but more when we're talking about it like kind of casually, we tend to look for like the one decision that somebody made that was problematic. And it's really important to understand that an avalanche, or when something goes wrong, it was like a lot of decisions that led up to that moment. It wasn't just like, and then we skied the line and the thing happened. And so making sure that you're weighting all of those small decisions equally and giving them equal respect, and also being kind of aware that even that decision of like who you're going out with, that's all part of this process that could lead to this thing, could lead to a good outcome or a bad outcome. And so it's essential to kind of like think through like, what is our goal? And then what is our process? So that was kind of like better group. Now we're going to talk a little bit about better you. So this is your brain on snow. So our brains are designed for doing one thing at a time. So if you are multitasking right now, you are not actually listening to me. Your brain is doing this thing where it's switching back and forth as fast as it can. And some people have a pretty fast mechanism and some people's mechanism is pretty slow. But regardless, your brain actually can't process two things at once. That's point A. Point B is that our brains are designed to predict, observe, and react to threat. That is like their sole purpose in life. And so our brains are kind of always ready to go into fight or flight mode. And the tricky part is that stoke activates a similar part of our brain as fear. And so our brains that are like sort of not able to multitask and are wired for like fight, flight, freeze, or like do something fun, if they get triggered into stoke or fear, they have a really hard time doing anything but that. So this is your brain, and this is an actual technical label. So I usually do it like this. So this is like your thinky parts. And then inside here is your feely parts. And if you want to watch a video called Real Facts About Marsupials, I think that's what it's called. That's where I learned all about thinky parts. But essentially when your feely parts turn on, your thinky parts turn off. And that is a really big problem because we need our thinky parts for all sorts of stuff, right? And everybody has a different mechanism around this. So you probably know yourself to either be somebody who has a high stress response or a low one. So EMTs, paramedics, ER nurses, they tend to do well in those jobs because they have a low stress response. Some people just don't get as activated and they have an easier time kind of keeping their thinky parts online. Other people get hysterical quickly. They get launched into fight or flight easily. So this is just kind of an important thing to know about yourself. The good news is that if your feely parts are activated and your thinky parts are turned off, there are actually some things that you can do to bring your thinking parts back online. And I'm going to teach you 3 of them right now because these are my total favorite things. So the first one, and usually I would do this, like we would all actually do this out loud, but you can all do it. You're all muted. So we're just going to spend 30 seconds naming every color that we see. And while you're doing this activity, I just want you to notice what's going on in your brain. And I encourage you to do it out loud. It actually works better. So ready, go. Excellent. Does anybody want to comment on what they noticed when they were doing it? There's no wrong answer, I promise.
I was focused.
On colors, right? On the colors that you saw. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. So in doing that, which if you're here in Whitefish, Montana in the backcountry, it usually sounds something like white, gray, dark gray, white. But even just paying attention to your surroundings, so you're actually using kind of the back of your brain, the occipital lobe, and then you're using the area of your brain that's producing language, is this beautiful way to kind of pull it back online. And if you need a way, to like regain sort of like thinking, sorry, that got a little wild. This is one way to do it. The other way that I love is to use box breathing or mountain breathing. So box breathing is you inhale for 4, you hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4 or 3, however long you want to do it. If you have a mountain, you can like trace with your eyes up one side of the mountain and then exhale, tracing down the other side of the mountain. It's like not a bad thing to do anyway. And when we're talking about companion rescue, this is when this skill becomes crucial. Everyone here has probably taught a course in which you set up a scenario and then like somebody rushes in, right? And like you haven't asked the other person to like turn off their beacon, or, you know, you're like not looking for clues, right? That's because they're operating solely from their feely parts. So we need to pull that back online. Another great one is to like encourage your group to be somehow engaged in it. I'm a child of the 80s, so I love the Beastie Boys. And I might just say, what's the time? And then my group could say, it's time to get ill. And that is like, it takes 5 seconds to do that. And we have all just like pulled ourselves back into this moment. Another one I love is like to just have a song that you sing. So when I was rock climbing more when I was younger, and I would get really like kind of nervous on the wall, I would just start singing the song El Paso. It's not by the Grateful Dead, but that's the version that I know. And if you have a song that you kind of sing regularly that your body can just pull up for you, it's another way to kind of like reactivate your good brain. None of these things will work in an emergency unless you have practiced them. So I recommend to people like, just start doing the color thing, like just do it regularly. It's good for you and it will help you. So this is another piece that I think is really important to understand when we're teaching folks, especially about companion rescue, because if they are in their fear part of their brain, they're not going to be able to use all of the resources that they have available. And we do not, sort of like rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. So we need to be practicing these things. So I recommend like when you're practicing companion rescue, you should like take 3 shots of espresso right before you hit the beacon park and get yourself really in that body state and then see how you do. So this is called the window of tolerance. This is like a really helpful thing to just understand humans in general, but stress and trauma reduce our window of tolerance. And if you think about the window of tolerance, like the way you can see the world, like how much you can experience and engage in the world, the more trauma and stress that you are experiencing in a moment or have experienced in your lifetime, the smaller your window gets. the more coping strategies you have, and I've listed some of mine, the larger your window of tolerance is. So we need to be practicing like good mental health care in general. But if we are in a situation where we are overwhelmed, our window of tolerance is likely to shrink. If we are in the top, if we get kicked out this way, we go into fight or flight mode. And when this happens, so if you can all imagine a time when this has happened, maybe it happened like when you were involved in a rescue, maybe it happened when you got pulled over by the police. Your legs get all of the blood flow, your legs and your arms, right? So if you're preparing for a fight, your legs and your arms need all of the energy. So where is the energy not? It's not in your brain. And so if we are in this kind of like stress state and our window has shrunk, our brain is not available to us so much. In the bottom half, we have the freeze or the numb. So this is like when you're sort of like checked out. So this is like you're overwhelmed, it's too much, and you kind of just like go blank. And everybody kind of has like a predisposition for one or the other. So some people are more freezy and some people are more fight or flighty. If you're in the freezy state, your window is really small and you're kind of just like checked out, and things are going to feel like they're happening in a movie. You're kind of like depersonalized. You're not really taking it all in, and your brain once again is offline. So it's important that we all practice good coping to keep our window big, but it's also important that when our window gets compressed in a stressful situation, we have these strategies to expand it. And so that's where the color naming and some of these other activities come from. Questions about the window of tolerance, because this is kind of like Psych 301, but I think it's a really important thing for us to understand, and I want to make sure folks get it. So any thoughts or questions about it? Or other ideas? And does anybody have any other ideas for grounding? Other methods that you really like? I'm going to give you one more. So this is for like folks who tend to be a little more logical. A great grounding activity is called serial sevens. So you count backwards from 100 by 7. And similar to the color naming, it takes a lot of brain power to focus on this. So like everybody's like 93, and then you're like, what's next, right? And your brain is like sort of immediately pulled from wherever it was into that present moment. And you can do it like 100 minus 3 if like sevens feel too hard. But the point is to like get yourself back into that present moment. A few other ones. So another thing that happens in your thinky parts is your motor cortex. So any movement. So even as simple as like releasing and then grabbing your ski poles, or tapping your helmet, or tapping your knees, like some kind of repetitive motion that just like convinces your body to like come back online and get back into this present moment is going to be super helpful. Okay, so I talked super fast, which was a goal. Chad, go for it.
I want to give a few more sources. So a guy named Daniel Siegel is pretty amazing at explaining this. And, you know, he has this book called The Whole Brain Child. And I remember when I had a kid, I was reading it. And it just talks about how your brain can go offline. And he has a way of explaining things that I think most people can get. And another guy named Daniel Goleman, he's very, very much involved in the world of emotional intelligence, which I think is what we're talking about basically. He has this concept of getting your brain hijacked. And so those are two authors that I think can talk to people on kind of lay terms, and you can really relate to them. Yeah,
I so appreciate that. And I think the the research and the writing on neuroscience right now is like prolific, because I think finally, especially thanks to like Bessel van der Kolk and some of these other trauma researchers, like we've started to really understand that trauma affects a lot of people. And I think it's important to name that, like in this group, right? That if you have been in this field for a while, there's a good chance you've been exposed to some trauma, and some of the work on like stress injury, and the stress continuum, like we really now understand like the impact of chronic exposure to trauma. And we also understand the impact of like singular trauma. And one of the, let's see, how do I say this? Like one of the things that we understand is that like the more you experience trauma, so just to go back here for a second, the more you experience trauma, the more likely it is that you have a smaller window of tolerance. So one of the defining characteristics of PTSD, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, which if you have trauma, it does not mean you have PTSD. But one of the sort of defining characteristics is that the person's world gets really small. So they can't go here because it reminds them of the trauma. They can't go here because they might be triggered. They can't listen to this music. They can't smell this thing. And their world, their window literally shrinks. And soon they're only going like one place at a time, or, you know, one thing a day. And their universe is really small and really limited. And so I think we all, as professionals who are in this network, should be looking out for each other and checking in with each other. And I think Chad, you had said like the culture, right, around this stuff is growing and getting stronger. And we all have this way that we can like influence that, right, and have more conversations about this kind of stuff. So this is my reference list, and I'm just going to kind of go through briefly to sort of highlight the pieces that I think, so if you're interested in certain stuff. So if you are interested in kind of like these death traps in your brain, I think one of the best books you can read is Predictably Irrational. Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow is another really great one. Think Again is a new book out by Adam Grant that really talks a lot about kind of like how to have that cognitive flexibility and how to think through things in new ways. And The Death of Expertise, as I said, is sort of like really relevant for the times. By the way, these books are not all necessarily like just psychology related. A lot of them are actually like talking about kind of like treatises on like the time, which I think is really interesting. Talking to Strangers is a phenomenal book, and I really recommend the audiobook version because Malcolm Gladwell infuses the book with actual interview tape. So you actually get to listen to the people that he interviewed. It's more like a podcast. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F is a great book for folks who struggle with anxiety or who have felt like their world is small. The Orchid and the Dandelion is a really great book about sensitivity and hypersensitivity. If you have a child who like refuses to wear jeans or brush their teeth because they really can't handle the sensoriness of that, that could be a good book to read. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts is a book by Gabor Mate. He also has a really phenomenal YouTube video that talks about the link between stress and trauma and addiction. And I know for many of us living in mountain communities, addictive behaviors can be really common. And he really helps us kind of understand how those two things are kind of like bedmates and maybe ways to kind of untangle them. And just to highlight one other thing, so if you're a person who has a hard time sleeping or calming your mind, Nothing Much Happens is a podcast. It's bedtime stories for adults where literally nothing much happens. So it's like a story like, and then she walked to the window and looked outside. And like, it's like nothing happens. And so your brain doesn't like hang on to anything. And it's also a beautiful way to kind of train your brain to like, just be a little less like jumping to conclusions.
I thought that was called Seinfeld.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's my household. That's great. So I'm going to stop my screen share and I'm going to just invite any questions, or if there is a slide that you want me to go back to or something that you want me to explain, I'm happy to do that because we still have some more time. It was a ton of information to process, I'm aware, but hopefully at least something stood out to you. I could do the thing that I ask all my class people to do, which is tell me one thing that did stick out to you. So this is a way for us to consolidate and to make sure we're encoding information. So go ahead and pop it in the chat or unmute yourself and say it. What is one thing that really stuck out?
I'll jump in there. I love the thinky parts and feely parts, and that it just all clicked when you said you can't use both of those things at the same time. That just explains so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the hard part about that, Larry, is like, we think we can, you know, and we're like, why is this not, why am I not functioning? You know, and it's like, you literally can't. So, yeah. Michael asked a great question. So can you expand more on what you mean by tolerance in the window of tolerance? So I think of tolerance as kind of our ability to manage the moment and to stay present while we're managing the moment. So if I can tolerate an experience, I can stay present with it and not get kind of like kicked out. Or, you know, as Chad said, like hijacked, right? So tolerance is kind of this ability to stay present and to stay with this experience that I'm having right now. And because our brains are so wired to just like look for threat and then deal with threat, the switch gets flipped. And then suddenly we're not tolerating anymore. We're just reacting, right? So tolerating is this presence of mind of like, I am here, I am with it, I am knowing, I am able to respond rather than react, versus like I'm out of my window and now I'm just like in this kind of panic state. Great. Any others? So what else stuck with everybody? Okay. And then
I'll go
for it, Robert.
I'll go ahead and go.
Or Chad, yeah.
Okay. I just letting other people talk, so just because I can talk about this stuff all day. So, you know, one of the things that I looked at was the encoding process, and it reminds me of Kolb's experiential learning cycle, and you know, talking about the importance of the debrief. And you said you're going to talk about debrief a little bit, and I'd love to hear more about how you incorporate that. I mean, the area framework now has that in there, which is great. So it'd be cool to see what are some techniques you use for debriefing.
Yeah, so I think that's great. And I totally skipped over it. So thanks for drawing my attention to that. I think that when we're debriefing, right, the easiest thing to do is kind of like celebrate the day and like cheers and like talk about how great it was, and then make sure to post it on Instagram and then like, yaha, we had a great day. And the important part is to like talk through like, so where were those choice points? And like, did we honor what we said we were going to do at the beginning of the day? And how did we make that decision? And where we are, like, we usually have like a long entry and a long exit on our ski tours. We have long drives. So we have like plenty of time if you're carpooling to do stuff like that. But even as simple as like the next time you go out, going back to like, remember what happened last time and remember how this, one of the questions that I've been asking some of my ski partners is like, how do you see me as a ski partner? How would you describe me if you were going to describe, like if you were inviting somebody new and you were like, I'm going out with Sarah, how would you describe me to that person? Because I think it's a nice way to like gain perspective and then just to have those conversations. So, you know, one of my friends, sometimes we tour with her brother. She's a very different person when her brother is there. And so that's another part of the debrief, is just sort of talking about those dynamics. Yeah, you can tell I'm like a psychologist. I'm like, okay, let's talk about feelings. I feel like somebody else was gonna chime in. Robert, yeah, go for it.
I was going to chime in, yeah, but I was listening to Chad's question. Cool. This is awesome because having gotten to ski and work and be examined by Larry, but like a bunch of these people I've like know and worked with, the thing that was really original, I thought that you brought up was trying to attach like cognitive bias or any potential human factor to conditions on the day or maybe even the team you're with. So I'm sure you have some more examples of that, but I'm wondering if other folks too, have experience with that, because that to me seems really original, and it'd be like a nice little box in your notebook to say, hey, I'm skiing with Dr. Sara today, and she tends to do this, or I tend to do this, or whatever, something like that. So.
Well, and I think one of like when we have lurking dragons, like when we have persistent weak layers, we should really be thinking about confirmation bias, right? So like there are certain elements of a snowpack or of a forecast that lead to those sort of things, which is, what I'm sort of hoping to expand on at some point and like write down for some people to read, because I think this is something that there are ways that we know these things might be more relevant. Or for example, if we're going out with a group of really experienced folks with one newbie, right? Like we know that we're going to have to do more facilitation to make sure we're like pulling that person into the decision making. If we're going out after a drought and we've been talking about skiing this certain peak all winter, right? Now we're thinking about like that commitment or opportunity sunk cost kind of stuff. So I think there are ways to kind of like get to know these biases and then think about for yourself, like what triggers these more. And then as a group or then as your community, how does this play out? But I think that, yeah, I love the idea of linking those. Like my hope is to someday have like those tools for forecasters to be able to like incorporate into their forecasts to talk about like, hey, this is something to consider. And I have a lot of free time, so I get tons of time to work on it, obviously. Mark, there's a great question in the chat. What's the impact of environmental factors like cold, dehydration, low blood sugar, altitude on some of these techniques? So like you can just kind of guarantee like that the harder your body is working, the harder your brain is working. And if your blood is really flowing to your legs, it's not flowing to your brain. And so the more we are struggling to be sort of just like on our feet, the more trouble we're going to be having. And so I think that's important too when we think about choice point, kind of like where are we making these choices along our route, and making those choices like after everybody's had their snack, not like right before. I think that's a really great question. Anything else anybody wants to share before we wrap up? Great. Well, I really appreciate everybody's participation. It like enriches my thinking, and I feel like I learn every time I talk, and I know there's so much knowledge and expertise and experience in this room. So thank you for sharing it with me. Emma, I'll turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome. And I will just quickly share something that really stuck out to me that I would like us to leave with is, and I think so much about what not only what students should be coming away with from their courses, but also how I want to be conducting myself in my own like personal touring. And I think about, practicing rescue and like tracking the season's conditions and all these things that we teach students. But he said something about that, these grounding techniques that you mentioned are not going to work in an emergency if we don't practice them. And really struck me how much we tell students that about rescue practice, but that's also something that we should be practicing is how is that emergency response. So thanks for that awesome perspective.
And I just want to add to that too, Emma, like this is so relevant in our daily lives also, like just coping, right? And so it's like, if you're a person who has trouble sleeping or you have kids who stress you out, like we can just be practicing these things. And the better we're doing in our daily lives, the less desperation or despair we're like bringing into the backcountry. Like last year was really hard for a lot of people. And when we are struggling, we make poorer choices for sure. So like, I'm here for it. That's my plug. Like, you don't have to get a therapist, but just like name some colors,
certainly seems like an easier first step.
And it's definitely cheaper too. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I am going to, I see that Sarah just dropped her email address into the chat. So thank you for that. And I just dropped a link in the chat as well to the rest of our upcoming webinars. We have a landing page on the avtraining.org website where you can see and register for the rest of our upcoming webinars. And then just briefly before I let everyone go, I just want to share this, the rest of our upcoming webinars. We have 2 more scheduled for sure. Steve Conger will be presenting on January 4th. That one promises to be really interesting. And he is also a really fun presenter. So looking forward to that. And then we also will have another sponsored webinar with Peeps on January 18th. And we're working to get a couple more Beacon webinars added as well, so that each of our Beacon sponsors has an opportunity to tell us about some of their newest products. So we're looking at adding a couple other dates soon. So keep an eye out on the instructor email updates and in the instructor Facebook group for more updates on those. And that landing page as well, that's at the bottom here and that I just dropped in the chat, is going to be, will be updated with registration links and information about each webinar as we add them. So thank you so much again. That was so wonderful and really fascinating. It's really fun to get kind of some new perspective on some of this stuff that we talk so much about. So great. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I will follow up with a link to this webinar as soon as I've had a chance to upload it to, it'll be on our Vimeo with a password, so that only folks who have registered for the webinar will be able to access it for now. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your night. And if we don't see you again for a while, have a safe season. And yeah, let's all be thinking about some of the stuff that we learned tonight. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much. That was really awesome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you.
So yeah, Liz and I'm sure we'll follow up with you in the next couple
Yeah,
of
and I'll try to figure out how to mail you or email you the PDF of the slides. That'll be my
That'll be
goal.
awesome.
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
try to do that. Okay.
Sweet. Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much. Have a great night.
Bye.